is describing the big black day in the future. The big black day of God's judgment. The great day of God's judgment. In fact, there are several references to it. Let me read them to you. Zephaniah chapter 1 verse 7 refers to the day of the Lord is at hand. Verse 8, the day of the Lord's sacrifice. Verse 9, in the same day. Verse 10, in that day. I have it underlined in my Bible so I can see it. Verse 12, it shall come to pass at that time. Verse 14, the great day of the Lord is near, it is near, and hastens greatly, even the voice of the day of the Lord. Verse 15, that day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of waste and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of the trumpet and alarm. Verse 18, the middle of the verse, refers to the day of the Lord's wrath. Verse 2 of chapter 2, the day of the Lord's anger. Again in verse 3, at the end of the verse, the day of the Lord's anger. And in verse 8 of chapter 3, therefore wait upon me, saith the Lord, until the day that I rise up to the prey. The day that I rise up to the prey. All of those are references to the fact that God has a day planned. It's Doomsday. How about that? Okay, it's called Doomsday. And the last part of the book in Zephaniah chapter 3 verses 9 to 20 is Delight Day. It's not Doomsday, it's the day of glory. And the final, this is the final day, if you wish, in God's calendar for planet Earth. It describes a glorious day of restoration, of blessing, of reordering of the earth's nations, a complete reversal of things as they are in the present. And so he says in verse 3:11, in that day, and he describes the changes. Verse 16, in that day. Verse 19, at that time. And in verse 20, at that time will I bring you again, even in the time that I gather you. For I will make you a name and a praise among all peoples of the earth when I turn back your captivity before your eyes, saith the Lord. And that hasn't happened in the history subsequent to the Babylonian invasion, which happened shortly after Zephaniah was prophet. There have been many small returns from the great exiles. There was a return unto Ezra, another return under Zerubbabel. There have been returns during my lifetime of the Falasha Jews from Ethiopia, and returns of Jewish people are continuing as we speak even now. There is a great exodus of Jewish people from around the world. Anti-Semitism is increasing dramatically in places like France and Germany, and even in the United States. For the first time now, there have been very open hostilities against Jewish students in universities and places like that. It's hitting the news. I've been reading about it, and Jewish people are returning to the land. But these voluntary returns, these partial returns, these small movements, as large as they may be sometimes in numbers, are not what Zephaniah describes. Zephaniah is describing a massive reversal of fortunes for the Jewish people in the final day of history in this world. Now let's go back through this book of 3 chapters and read the progress of the development of the theme as Zephaniah gives it to us. All right? And my Bible dates this 630 to 620, which is, and remember, Daniel was taken captive in 605. 605, and so this is just a few years before the Babylonians, in their first invasion of Palestine, took captives um, to decimate the royal families living in the country. The word of the Lord which came unto Zephaniah, the son of Cushi, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. I have a little chart here that most of you, unless you have myopia very badly. Yeah, Brenda, would you want to just come up here and look at this? Hezekiah was the 13th king of Judah, the remaining tribe. By this time, the 10 northern tribes had already been taken captive by the Assyrians in 722. Hezekiah was a good king. He was a very good king, but he was a failure in that his son Manasseh was not raised properly and became the worst king of any of the kings that had ever ruled Israel. In fact, he reigned longer than any of the other kings, north or south. For 45 years, King Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah, reigned in Judah, and he almost destroyed the country. In fact, the judgment fell, God says, because of Manasseh. He brought idols and the pagan sex-based worship of the day of the Baals into the actual temple itself. He put the signs of the zodiac around inside the holy place and erected altars to all the different Baals and Ashtoreths, male and female goddesses and stuff throughout the city of Jerusalem. He filled Jerusalem with idolatry, and he ruined the country. Interestingly, he was taken sick, and I believe he was taken captive. And he, in his captivity, he actually repented at the end of his life, and God forgave him and restored him. But because of his sins and the damage he'd done to the country, God finally brought judgment upon Judah years later. So King Hezekiah was a good king. So you notice that there are 3 generations to Josiah. This makes Josiah the great-grandson of Hezekiah. And Zephaniah was a relative of Josiah, who was the king, through a different brother of Manasseh, through a different son of Hezekiah. Okay, so Zephaniah was 4 generations removed from Hezekiah. Josiah was 3 generations removed. Who knows how they related to each other in age? We have no idea. But they lived at the same time. All right? It says it right here. That's why you need to pay attention to the names and actually go back in history and look it up in the Kings, because it'll help you see the story. So that first verse is of tremendous importance. He ministered in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. So this prophet was actually of the royal seed, just a different brother. He was related, probably 3rd or 4th cousin to the reigning king, Josiah. Josiah was a good king. He was a phenomenal king. He was the last good king that Judah had. And in spite of the fact that during this time, Josiah was a great king, he was trying to undo everything that his grandfather Manasseh had done. God sent this man, a cousin of the king, to prophesy throughout Judah to warn the people that God's judgment was going to fall on them and the Gentiles, their enemies, and yet God was not going to forget his covenant promises to them, and he was going to keep them and restore them. So, 2 days on God's calendar are the theme of this book. Any questions? To help us get a sense of the context here, would you turn with me back to 1 Kings 21? We'll come back to Zephaniah in a minute. I want to read a few verses from 1 Kings 21 just to show you the good stuff that Josiah was doing. Did I say 1 Kings? 2 Kings, and it's 22. 2 Kings 22. I have a list on this page of 16 things that King Josiah did that were good, and God has a record of them. This man had a lot of nerve for the Lord. He was just a young boy when he began to reign. Verse 1 says he was 8 years old when he began to reign. Obviously, he would have had priests and handlers to help him. His mother's name was Jedediah, the daughter of Adiah of Bozkath. He did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, and walked in all the way of David his father, turned not aside to the right hand or to the left. Okay, now we start to get some of the things that he did here. It came to pass in the 18th year of King Josiah that the king sent Shaphan the son of Azaliah the son of Meshullam the scribe to the house of the Lord, saying, Go up to Hilkiah the high priest, that he may reckon the amount of the silver which is brought into the house of the Lord, which the keepers of the door have gathered of the peoples, and let them deliver it into the hand of the doers of the work, who have the oversight of the house of the Lord, and let them give it to the doers of the work who are in the house of the Lord, to repair the breaches of the house. Unto carpenters, builders, masons, and to buy timber and hewn stone to repair the house. Howbeit there was no reckoning made with them of the money that was delivered to their hand, because they dealt faithfully. This sort of there was a hiatus in the repairs to the temple. Joash had begun these repairs earlier, but for some reason they were interrupted. And so he personally ordered the temple repaired after the destruction done to it by his great-grandfather, or by his grandfather, Manasseh. In verse 8 through 20, which we won't read all of it, we read that Josiah was tender and repentant to God's word. He was in communication with the scribes and with the prophetesses. Verse 10, Shaphan the scribe showed the king a copy of the scriptures, saying, Hilkiah the priest has delivered to me a book, and Shaphan read it before the king. And it came to pass, when the king had heard the words of the book of the law, that he tore his clothes. The king commanded Hilkiah the priest, and Ahikam the son of Shaphan, and others, saying, Go, inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah concerning the word of this book that's found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not hearkened to the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us. And so, verse 19 records the word of the prophetess Huldah to the king. Because your heart was tender, and you have humbled yourself before the Lord, when you heard what I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, that they should become a desolation and a curse, and have torn your clothes and wept before me, I also have heard thee, saith the Lord. Behold, therefore, I will gather you to your fathers, and you shall be gathered into grave in peace, and your eyes shall not see all the evil which I will bring upon this place. And they brought the king word again. Josiah died 3 years before the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem or invaded Jerusalem. And so God kept his word. And the king, this king was blessed in his lifetime. In chapter 23, we find that the king taught the people God's word. He gathered all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. The king went up to the house of the Lord, and all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem were with him, the priests, the prophets, the people, both small and great. Undoubtedly, this included Zephaniah, although he's not mentioned by name. But the prophets of Judah were gathered by Josiah in a kind of a revival to reorient the populace back to God. Both young and old, and he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant which was found in the house of the Lord. Not only did they read it, but the king made an open covenant to obey God's law. Verse 3, the king stood by a pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord, to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes, etc. All the people in Jerusalem joined this covenant. And then in verses 4, we begin to see the degree to which Josiah brought about reforms. I think it's worth reading through this. He commanded Hilkiah the high priest and the priests of the second order and the keepers of the door to bring forth out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels that were made for Baal and for the idol and for all the hosts of heaven. That's the signs of the zodiac. his grandfather had put in there. He burned them outside of Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron and carried their ashes to Bethel. By the way, since the time of Jeroboam, 300 years before, Bethel had been a center of idolatry. Bethel is the place where Abraham offered sacrifices when God brought him into the land. It was where Jacob worshipped God centuries before. And yet, after Solomon's foolishness in marrying many foreign women and idolatrous women, God had broken the kingdom in half because of that. And the subsequent leader of the northern 10 tribes made Bethel a rival worship center to Jerusalem. He didn't want the people in the 10 northern tribes going down to Jerusalem into the south. He wanted to keep them in the north. And so he turned Bethel, which means house of God, Beit El, he made that place a rival idolatrous worship center, contrary to the scriptures. And it says in verse 5 that Josiah, 300 years later, put down the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense in the high places in the cities of Judah and in the places round about Jerusalem, and them also who burned incense to Baal, to the sun, and to the moon, and to the planets, and to all the hosts of heaven. He brought out the idol from the house of the Lord outside of Jerusalem to the brook Kidron, and burned it in the brook Kidron, stamped it to small powder, cast the powder of it upon the graves of the children of the people. Listen to this. He broke down the houses of the Sodomites that were by the house of the Lord. Why were the homosexuals, living beside the house of the Lord? I have no idea. But it's sort of like down in Toronto, that 1 mile square around the Parliament buildings in Queen's Park, there are 100,000 homosexuals that live around the Parliament buildings. And I don't know what it is, but it's almost like the devil likes to just surround places of government and power with the lowest of the low that he can, he just takes the moral depravity of the nation and just like a magnet to the power centers. And that's what happened in Jerusalem. The Sodomites were living right outside the temple and practicing their lifestyle there. And Josiah destroyed their house. He broke down the houses of the Sodomites that were by the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the idol. And he brought all the priests out of the cities of Judah and defiled the high places where the priests had burned incense, from Geba to Beersheba. Geba is north, Beersheba is south. So the whole land was cleansed of idolatry. He broke down the high places of the gates that were in the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which were on a man's left hand at the gate of the city. He defiled Topheth, verse 10, that's in the valley of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or his daughter to pass through the fire. This is child sacrifice, was practiced inside the walls of Jerusalem, and he defiled those altars. Verse 11, he took away the horses that the kings of Judah had given to the sun at the entrance of the house of the Lord. By the way, what do they call that horse with a spike coming out of its head?
Unicorn.
A unicorn. That's an occultic symbol. Did you know that? It's an occultic symbol. It's a representation of sun worship. Okay? And this is a very ancient practice. And when Josiah became king, he got rid of those. He got rid of the horses that were dedicated to the worship of the sun. And they were placed right outside the entrance to the... Everybody had to go through the horses to come into the temple to worship, He burned their chariots of the sun with fire. Verse 12, the altars that were on the top of the upper chamber of Ahaz, which the kings of Judah had made, and the altars which Manasseh, that's Josiah's grandfather, had made, in the two courts of the house of the Lord, did the king beat down and broke them down from there, cast the dust of them into the brook Kidron. And the high places that were before Jerusalem, which were on the right hand of the mount of corruption, which Solomon the king of Israel had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the abomination of the Moabites, for Milcom, the abomination of the children of Ammon, did the king defile. So here we are, 600 BC. Solomon lived 900 BC. So for 300 years of Jewish history, the kings of Judah had allowed this garbage to exist. And it existed coincidentally, at the same time with with the worship of God in the temple, and it just got worse and worse, little by little. These people brought this stuff in. Josiah just wiped it clean. I mean, he was an extremist, right? Think he had friends? He was serious, right? Verse 14, he broke in pieces the images and cut down the idols, filled their places with the bones of men, so that people wouldn't touch them and be defiled ritually. Moreover, the altar that was at Bethel and the high place which Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, had made, both that altar and the high place he broke down, burned the high place, stamped it to small powder, and burned the idol. And as Josiah turned himself, he spied the sepulchres that were there in the mount, and sent and took the bones out of the sepulchres and burned them. He went personally to defile these idolatrous centers. And verse 19, and all the houses also of the high places that were in the cities of Samaria, which the king of Israel had made to provoke the Lord to anger, Josiah took away. Like, he didn't just stay within his borders of Judah. He went into the territory that the Assyrians controlled. This is kind of risky business. He's probably not that strong of a king, and he goes outside of his border into Assyrian-controlled territory in the 10 northern tribes, and he does the cleanup job up there as well. Sort of like, what would be the analogy for us today? It would be kind of like, okay, start in your own house and get rid of the garbage in your house, throw out all the magazines and the pictures, and get rid of the videos and the DVDs, and clean house. And then knock on your neighbor's door. Let me see your collection here. I'm going to go through and break these ones up too. Walk down to Sault Ste. Marie, go through, and stand up on the corner and have a press conference, and start preaching against the people, like St. Francis of Assisi back in the days of. Wasn't he the one that stood up in Venus and he preached against the sin of the aristocracy and they killed him? It was a Roman Catholic priest back in the 1400s or 1100s or something. And, there have been reformers like this down through history. Okay, one more verse I want you to read. Verse 19, all the houses also of the high places that were in the cities of Samaria, which the kings of Israel had made to provoke the Lord to anger, Josiah took away and did to them according to all the acts that he had done in Bethel. And he slew all the priests of the high places who were there upon the altars and burned men's bones upon them. So he just didn't break down their altars. He said, come here, you're a priest? You work at this altar? Come here. I want you to come back to the altar. Chop their heads off on the altar that they'd been defiling. And then he reinstituted the Passover. And this was an amazing thing. Verse 25 says, and like him there was no king before him who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, neither after him arose there any like him. And this man was a... I'm sorry? In
1 Kings 13:2, he was called by name, and prophesied that he would do that.
Really? I want to read that. 1 Kings
2, I had it marked in my Bible.
Well, behold, there came a man of God out of Judah by the word of the Lord to Bethel, and Jeroboam stood by the altar to burn incense, and he cried against the altar and the word of the Lord, and said, O altar, altar, thus saith the Lord, behold, a child shall be born unto the house of David, Josiah by name, and upon thee shall he offer the priests of the high places who burn incense upon thee, and men's bones shall be burned upon thee.
350 years before he was born.
Actually, it's 291. Isn't that interesting? That's amazing. Now, we're supposed to be studying Zephaniah, but that is the actual, that's the social, historical, legal, political, and religious context in which Zephaniah was prophet. He was a relative of Josiah, and he was one of those prophets probably that was gathered into the city at the time of these reforms. Now, let's go back to Zephaniah at the end of the Old Testament. And let's read God's doomsday judgment through this prophet. And I want you to note that this is the day of the Lord's wrath, and it's divided into three sections. In chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, we have general judgment prophesied upon the earth, sky, and sea. There's going to be cosmic, physiological, or earth physical judgments. Verses 4 to 15, judgments upon Judah and Jerusalem. Verses 16 to 18, the whole of Palestine. And then there are related judgments upon the surrounding nations later on in chapter 3. I will utterly consume all things from off the land, saith the Lord, verse 2. I will consume man and beast, I will consume the fowls of the heavens and the fish of the sea, and the stumbling blocks with the wicked, and I will cut off man from the land, saith the Lord. I will also stretch out my hand upon Judah, and upon all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and I will cut off the remnant of Baal from this place, and the name of the Chimarim with the priests. I don't know what that means. And those who worship the host of heaven upon the housetops, and those who worship and who swear by the Lord and who swear by Malcolm. And by the way, did you know my folks are from Colorado? And I've read numerous times in various magazines, Time and Newsweek, that summer solstice, certain times of the year, people who are into the New Age, occult religion, the sun worshippers, they gather in certain places in Colorado. There are several centers in Colorado where they go up into the mountains, these high meadows where the air is clear, and they get as close to the sun as they can in these high places in the world. They gather by the thousands to worship the sun. All right? And this is similar to the ancient worship of the sun that was practiced in Israel. People would go as high as they could, which is, go up the top of the house, go up on a roof, close to the sun as you can get, right? Symbolically entering into communion with the sun. And God is angry with any form of idolatry, whether it be sun worship or the worship of, particular deities. Verse 6, and those who are turned back from the Lord, and those who have not sought the Lord nor inquired for him. Hold your peace at the presence of the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is at hand. For the Lord has prepared a sacrifice, he has bidden his guests, and it shall come to pass in the day of the Lord's sacrifice that I will punish the princes and the king's children and all such as are clothed with foreign apparel. In the same day also I will punish all those who leap on the threshold, who fill their masters' houses with violence and deceit. It shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord, that there shall be the noise of a cry from the fish gate, and a wailing from the second quarter, and a great crashing from the hills. Describing particular judgments on the city of Jerusalem here. Wail, you inhabitants of Maktesh, for all the merchant people are cut down, all they that bear silver are cut off. And it shall come to pass at that time that I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and punish the men that are settled on their lees, that say in their heart, the Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil. Therefore their goods shall become a booty, and their houses a desolation, and they shall also build houses, but not inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards, but not drink the wine of them. The great day of the Lord is near, it is near, and hastens greatly, even the voice of the day of the Lord. The mighty man shall cry there bitterly. He describes it. We've read some of these verses. Chapter 2, gather yourselves together, yea, gather together, O nation not desired. This is a call to repentance now. Before the decree bring forth, before the day pass like the chaff, before the fierce anger of the Lord come upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger come upon you, seek the Lord, all ye meek of the earth who have kept his ordinances. Seek righteousness, seek meekness. It may be you shall be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. By the way, Jesus taught nothing different than Zephaniah. In the so-called Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, Jesus said, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Jesus said that. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Jesus lived under the old covenant, the same covenant that Zephaniah lived under. The old covenant started with Moses, and it was a covenant of works in the sense that if you obey, I will bless you. Remember this? This is almost a mantra here that I've preached for years. If you obey, I will bless you. If you disobey, I will curse you. And it was tit for tat sort of thing. And this is the arrangement that God had with his people. So throughout the periods of general obedience, God generally blessed. For individual obedience, like this man's lifetime, Josiah, God blessed him. But the other was also true. And so the prophets always had a twofold message. Blessing for obedience, judgment for disobedience. And so they were always mixed, because there was also always some people, like the Boazes and the Ruths and the Josiahs and the Jehoidas and the Huldas, and the Deborahs. There were always there's always a believing remnant that God would pour out his blessing upon on an individual or family level, or if it was prevalent, upon the society. And so it's always appropriate for the prophets, so the Old Testament period, to make an appeal for repentance to the people. Seek righteousness, seek meekness, it may be you shall be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. Did you know that God will hide the remnant during this great day, this doomsday? It's detailed in Ezekiel, where he will hide his people out in the wilderness, and there's going to be a place in the wilderness. In Revelation chapter 12, still describing these doomsday judgments, chapter 12 describes the woman being taken into the wilderness and hidden in the wilderness from the wrath of the devil, right? And his armies of heaven that are seeking to destroy, in an anti-Semitic convolution throughout the world, trying to destroy God's people and all believers. And God will save, what did Jesus say in Matthew chapter 25? I think it was chapter 24. He that endures to the end shall be saved. Describing the same end time judgments. He that endures to the end shall be saved. God will save his elect. He will save his believing remnant. It says in the same chapter in Matthew 24, except those days should be shortened, even the elect should be destroyed, should be killed. Right? So God supernaturally puts his hand over the believing remnant throughout history. He did it for Jeremiah when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. Right? Jeremiah spent weeks and months, maybe even years, in prison by his people. As soon as the Babylonians took the city, they took him out of prison and they let him go. Right? In a complete reversal of fortunes. And this is an illustration of the way God deals with the believing remnant. Okay? So God's judgment is pronounced upon Israel, Jerusalem, and the people in the land for their idolatry. And now he extends in chapter 2 through the surrounding nations. We're not going to read it, but look at the names. I'll just pick the names out. Verse 4. For Gaza shall be forsaken, Ashkelon a desolation. They shall drive out Ashdod at noonday. Ekron shall be rooted up. This is the Palestinian princely cities. Verse 5, his judgment on the Philistines, I will even destroy you, that there shall be no inhabitant. Verse 8, I have heard the reproach of Moab and the revilings of the children of Ammon, whereby they have reproached my people and magnified themselves against their border. Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab shall be like Sodom, and the children of Ammon like Gomorrah. By the way, that would have been very meaningful, because Ammon and Moab border the Dead Sea where Sodom and Gomorrah were once located, right? And so all they have to do is kind of look over there down to the lowest spot on the earth, and they can see they can't see the remnants, but that's even there today. In modern Israel, there are signs. This is the place, traditional location of ancient Sodom and Gomorrah. I've seen pictures of it, right? And that's where those countries are. And so God says, read the signs. Verse 12, you Ethiopians also, you shall be slain by the sword. I want to back up. Verse 10 and 11. This shall they have for their pride, because they have reproached and magnified themselves against the people of the Lord of hosts. The Lord will be terrible to them, for he will famish all the gods of the earth, and men shall worship him, every one from his place, even all the coasts of the nations. Do you think North America is going to survive God's judgment in this great doomsday? Not a chance, because God in judgment always destroys the gods, the false gods that have opposed him. And throughout our country, North America, Canada, United States, the Western world, there is a sweeping movement in New Age where every man and woman believes they are God. So God's judgment has to extend to every one of these so-called gods that live in our culture, that see them people that see themselves as gods. And God is angry with that. And his judgment is going to be broad and vast. God's judgment is extended to the Assyrians, verse 13, and Nineveh, a desolation. Let's keep reading chapter 3. Woe to her that is filthy and polluted, to the oppressing city, returning to Jerusalem now. She obeyed not the voice, she received not correction, she trusted not in the Lord, she drew not near to her God. Her princes within her are roaring lions, her judges are evening wolves. They gnaw not the bones till the morrow. I don't quite understand that. Maybe they eat them up all tonight. I don't know. Her prophets are light and treacherous persons. Her priests have polluted the sanctuary. They have done violence to the law. The just Lord is in the midst of her. He will not do iniquity. Every morning doth he bring his justice to light. He faileth not, but the unjust knoweth no shame. Isn't that a verse you could stick on the post that applies to North America? Just stick that on the board out front. God hasn't changed. He's still a holy God, and your sin is still sin to him. Right? Our sin is still sin to him. I have cut off the nations, God says. Verse 6, their towers are desolate. I made their streets waste, that none passeth by. Their cities are destroyed, so that there is no man, that there is no inhabitant. I said, surely you will fear me. You will receive instruction. So their dwelling shall not be cut off. However, I punished them, but they rose early and corrupted all their doings. He's recounting how that repeatedly throughout the history of Israel and Judah, God sent his prophets. There were revivals, or there was rejection of the prophets, and it happened over and over and over again. And you read the summary of these two periods in 2 Kings 17 and 2 Kings 25. We have summaries of the hundreds of years of divine patience with the 10 northern tribes, summarized in 2 Kings 17. They rejected his prophets, and so he finally judged them. Same thing in chapter 25 for Judah. And here we have an allusion to that. Therefore, end verse in this first section. Here's the summary on Doomsday. Therefore, wait upon me, saith the Lord, until the day that I rise up to the prey. For my determination is to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation, even all my fierce anger, for all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. Folks, the predictions in this book have not been completely fulfilled. Partially yes, completely no. The whole earth has not received final judgment from God. That awaits a final doomsday judgment. Do you believe that? You believe that? Justice has not yet been served to Canada, to the United States, to Britain, to France, Germany, Japan, Central America. The corrupt dictatorships that have been propped up by the United States all through Central and South America over the years. God's still going to have his day, and he's going to set it right. He's going to punish people for their greed and for their injustice and for their violence. So now he turns from judgment to the day of blessing and restoration that follows doomsday. For then, after this judgment of all the nations of the earth, keep reading verse 9, for then will I turn to the peoples a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord, to serve him with one consent. I don't know it. The world is not full of universal purity and everybody worshiping God. It's never been that way. It's not been fulfilled yet in history. I long for the day, like Peter in the New Testament, 2 Peter 3, 11 through 13. We long as Christians for the day, for that kingdom that's coming, in which dwells righteousness. And God is going to, purify this earth, and he's going to set it right. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my suppliants, even the daughter of my dispersed, shall bring mine offering. This is not talking about heaven. This is talking about earth. There's going to be an earthly, if this is literal, it describes earthly changes, not unlike heavenly changes where, righteousness is going to prevail in heaven, and it's also going to prevail on earth. Jesus said, taught his disciples, Our Father which art in heaven, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, it's going to happen. Jesus' prayer is someday going to be fulfilled in heaven and on earth, where the divine rule in heaven is going to be extended to earth, and people who actually live in this world, everybody, is going to worship him. It says it right here. Everybody's going to speak a pure language. All men are going to call on the name of the Lord, to call on him with one consent from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. In that day, verse 11, shalt thou not be ashamed for all thy doings in which you have transgressed against me, for then I will take away out of the midst of thee those who rejoice in thy pride, and thou shalt no more be haughty in my holy mountain. I will also leave in the midst of thee an afflicted and poor people, and they shall trust in the name of the Lord. The remnant of Israel shall not do iniquity, nor speak lies, neither shall a deceitful tongue be found in their mouth, for they shall feed and lie down, and none shall make them afraid. What does this mean? All you have to do is read the 20th chapter of Ezekiel, where it says that when Jesus Christ comes out of heaven at the second advent, that he comes to Jerusalem, he takes his people into the wilderness, and he separates the sheep from the goats, the believers from the non-believers. And the believers he will keep, and the unbelievers he will kill in the wilderness. And then he brings the believing Jewish remnant back into the city of Jerusalem, where he establishes his kingdom. And the only way that means anything is if it's literal, and it actually is going to happen someday. It fits perfectly with this, that there's going to be a believing remnant, and that believing remnant is going to live on the earth. They're going to experience a kingdom where God himself reigns, and everybody is a believer. And there's going to be universal peace. And so he says in verse 14, sing, O daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel, be glad and rejoice with all the heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord hath taken away thy judgments, he has cast out your enemy, the King of Israel, even the Lord is in the midst of thee. That fits what it says in Psalm 110 and Jeremiah 30, where it talks about David, or somebody reigning from the house of David is going to rule in the earth, and he's going to rule from Jerusalem. And it says right here, God, your king, is going to reign in the midst of you. You shall not see evil any more. In that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, fear thou not, and to Zion, let not your hands be slack. The Lord thy God in the midst of thee is mighty. He will save. We sing that song as if it applies today. Well, it does, partially, but this is a prophecy in a context of end time, post-doomsday fulfillments of God's reign in this world. The Lord thy God is in the midst of thee. He's mighty. He will save. He will rejoice over thee with joy. He will rest in his love. He will joy over thee with singing. I will gather those who are sorrowful for the solemn assembly, who are of thee, to whom the reproach of it was a burden. Behold, at that time I will undo all that afflict thee. I will save her that is lame, and gather her that was driven out, and I will get them praise and fame in every land where they have been put to shame. At that time will I bring you again, even in the time that I gather you, for I will make you a name and a praise among all peoples of the earth. It's not talking about the New Jerusalem here. It's talking about the earth. When I turn back your captivity before your eyes, saith the Lord. And I am I'm so much anticipating to see this illustration of divine rule on the earth. I believe, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, that it says when Jesus Christ returns out of heaven, we're going to be caught up together, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. That's talking about believers. So shall we ever be with the Lord. Where's Jesus going to be? Well, after Doomsday, he's going to come down here. He's going to set up a kingdom. And he's going to do literally the things that he's promised in the prophets. And it's been awaiting for thousands of years for fulfillment. And the believing remnant that is alive at the time is going to be that generation that's going to experience seeing Jesus Christ separate the sheep from the goats. They're going to experience his feet cleaving the Mount of Olives, setting up his kingdom on the earth. He's going to see the physical judgments of the nations who have gathered in a great final convolution of, anger and hostility against the God of heaven. It's going to be an amazing time. So shall we ever be with the Lord. I think we're going to be eyewitnesses to these events. I believe that eventually we're going to go to heaven. It's going to, read through the events in the book of Revelation. I think there is a new heaven and a new earth, and I believe that believers do then subsequently dwell in the New Jerusalem. But even the last chapters of the book of Revelation describe the nations of the earth will have access to the New Jerusalem. What does that mean? It can only mean that there is going to be a new order in the new world that somehow parallels the